Les gens, les boxeurs comme style concepteur agressif, ils ont toujours ces t-shirts un peu à la Tyson, là, des shorts du four, un petit
When I say you must obey, just like the both of you took my
Et là, Maïva, ce sont les deux.
Ouais, magnifique crochet. Magnifique shot.
Ah, c'est un vrai coup au corps.
Et ouais, le crochet au foie, il a touché.
Là, c'est un vrai coup au corps.
Pendant Bigor, encore un rouge.
Au corps.
Allez, c'est met dur là, Diane qui a arrêté.
Oui, forcément, elle remet un genou au sol.
Et elle regarde son point.
Okay, we'll start with this. Well, as previously reported, Daniela Bermudez, the WBO bantamweight champion, yesterday moved up in weight to the super bantamweight division to contend for the newly vacated IBF title, the title that Marcela Acuña vacated. Marcela, who's a champion in recess. And, you know, we all know this Zrazevskaya fight.
That got canceled.
And Daniela ended up facing the less adequately equipped Castillo, who Daniela, in so many words, battered and played with. This goes back to what I told you guys before, that Daniela would have faced a lot more resistance in Tatiana than what we saw yesterday with Cintia. Cintia was out of her depth and overall was outclassed. Now there's a question as to whether or not Daniela will stay in the super bantamweight division and reign there as their IBF champion, or will she do what she did before when she beat Marcela?
Move back down.
Over a year ago. Will she decide to vacate the title that she just won at this weight and move back down and continue to reign as the WBO's bantamweight champion? This time, I think Daniela's here to stay. I think she's going to stay in the super bantamweight division. And this is where Mayerling Rivas is the reigning WBA champion. Yamilet Mercado is the reigning WBC champion. Dina Thorsland is the reigning WBO champion. And now, Daniela Bermudez is ranked among them as the reigning IBF champion. I wonder if we'll see a rematch between Marcela Acuña, the champion in recess, as a champion in recess is afforded a world title opportunity as soon as they snap back into action. Is that what's next for Daniela, or are we going to get to see that Tatiana Zrazevskaya fight? Is that going to be rescheduled? Is there any hope that that comes off? Really don't know. It's too soon to tell. These are the variables. These are the different scenarios that could spell out what the immediate future might hold for Daniela Bermudez, the newly crowned IBF Super Bantamweight champion, moving forward into 2021. In a more shocking bit of news that broke earlier today, get this. Female boxer, 34 years old, arrested on suspicion of beating rich husband, 61 years old, to death. And they're talking about Vivian Obenauff. Vivian Obenauff, who was an opponent for Katie Taylor, Chantel Cameron,
Remember?
Maiva Hamadouche, Terry Harper. We've all seen her before. We know Vivian.
Oh, the fuck we don't.
Brazilian-born Vivian Obenauff, who has fought 3 times in world title bouts, married her 61-year-old husband in January. Today, she stands accused of beating him to death with a blunt object in the apartment they shared in. Obenauff, 34 years old, was arrested this week and is currently in investigative custody after the victim died from, quote-unquote, sustained violent assault. The victim, whose name is protected by Swiss law, died of massive injuries inflicted with a blunt object, Swiss police stated. Obenauff was born in Rio de Janeiro, and as a youngster she played football and was an Olympic gymnast before turning to boxing at the age of 18. She was successful in her boxing career, winning 14 fights against 6 losses before retiring from the ring last year. She started working in the hospitality industry in Switzerland after retiring from the sport, and then later opened her own gym. You think you know somebody, you know?
Yeah.
Who would have figured that under that gorgeous physique, that bubbly demeanor, lied a vicious, cruel, cold, calculating murderer? Perhaps I'm jumping to conclusions. We don't actually know that Vivian did what she's being accused of. We're on the other side of the fucking world. All we know is what we're being told. But based on the story, based on these reports, it appears that Vivian's husband, I guess he pissed her off one time, too many, and she took action, took matters into her own hands. It's anybody's guess what was going on here. This may have been a crime of passion, you know. Maybe this is a case of infidelity and Vivian lashed out. Maybe the old man, Daddy Warbucks, you know, maybe he was going to file for a divorce. Because if Vivian Obenauff is in fact guilty of what she's being accused of, striking her 61-year-old husband to death, a sustained assault with a blunt force object, if she's guilty of this, there's only so many things that could have caused that kind of reaction. Perhaps Daddy Warbucks wanted to divorce her, maybe due to infidelity on her part or his. I mean, what could this man have said that led to this? What could have been going on that led us here and Vivian to murder? And you know she's got a kid. You know that she's a mom. I mean, Christ's sake. Guess dating a boxer ain't all it's cracked up to be, even one as gorgeous and bubbly as Vivian Obenauff. I mean, to look at her, Vivian Obenauff doesn't strike me as a homicidal maniac, though looks can be deceiving. Now, can't they? This is the same Vivian Obenauff that upset the plans for Natasha Jonas. Gave her her first professional loss in that shock upset. Wasn't expecting that at all. But if you want my opinion, and you're here, so I'll assume that you do, there's not much room here to jump to finite, concrete conclusions. It's anybody's guess what the hell happened. Though looking at it, this does look like your run-of-the-mill, textbook crime of passion.
Terrible fucking tragedy.
If you follow Vivian Obenauff's social media, the stuff she posts seems like a generally kind, loving mom, sweet lady, and an athlete. But, you know, that's the thing about social media. It just gives you a false representation of things. It doesn't actually show you what's underneath it all, underneath the skin, what a person's life might really be like, because something must have been terribly fucking wrong for Vivian Obenauff, assuming she's guilty of all of this. Something must have been very wrong for this to be the culmination, the end game, as it were. The end game being murder. In super middleweight news, straight from the desk of Paco Varicel, the WBO's president, congratulations to WBO champion Billy Joe Saunders. The WBO is waiting for Eddie Hearn to advise within 10 days if he will face Canelo or Andrade next. If he doesn't face either one, we will order him to face a mandatory challenger designated by the WBO's championships committee. You'll notice that Paco Varicel didn't name anyone in particular as Billy's mandatory challenger. The current WBO ranked standings at this weight indicate that Canelo Alvarez is their number one contender. However, we know Canelo won't be facing Billy Joe Saunders next because he's going to be fighting Callum Smith. The man behind Canelo Alvarez is none other than the UK's own Zach Parker. But Paco didn't mention Zach Parker by name. He said they would order Billy Joe Saunders to fight a mandatory challenger of the WBO's choosing. That kind of leaves the door open for it to be Zach or for it not to be Zach. Could be the guy ranked behind Zach. It could be Daniel Jacobs, who ranks in at number 3. Daniel Jacobs, who was last in action not that long ago, whereas Zach Parker hasn't seen any action since the Rohan Murdoch fight, which was on the undercard of Scott Quigg versus John O'Carroll back in early March of this year, before COVID shut everything down. Essentially, Zach Parker hasn't seen any action in months, whereas Daniel Jacobs was in action not that long ago. The current set of rank standings you're looking at aren't the November rank standings. Those ranks aren't in yet. These are the October rank standings. That being said, it's conceivable that Daniel Jacobs, having fought more recently than Zach, might actually be the guy that occupies the number 2 spot once the ranks are updated, because Zach, that guy hasn't fought in months. And Zach does want that Billy Joe Saunders fight, you know. He's trying to become that guy's mandatory challenger, but that hasn't actually happened yet. And I reiterate, Paco Varicel, while stating that they would order Billy Joe Saunders to fight their mandatory challenger, someone of their choosing, while he may have said that, he didn't mention Zach by name.
He didn't.
It's possible that if Billy doesn't fight Canelo, which we know that he isn't, or Demetrius, which doesn't seem all that likely either. It's possible that what the WBO might do is order him to fight Daniel Jacobs, who by the time that order comes down could be ranked in the number 2 spot, ahead of Zach Parker. And I don't think Zach's going to be happy about that, but, you know.
What do you want?
You can't please everybody. Post-fight, after his dominant showing over Martin Murray, Billy let it be known that he wants the big fights, the unification matches. He addressed Canelo Alvarez, he addressed Callum Smith, but we know that's not going to be Billy's next fight. Comparatively, a Daniel Jacobs fight is a bigger fight than, say, a Zach Parker fight. You know what? A Daniel Jacobs fight really is just what the doctor ordered for Billy Joe Saunders. He looked good out there against Martin Murray, but I don't have any illusions about why he looked that way. Martin Murray, at his age, couldn't pose but so much resistance. Daniel, maybe, could give us a more spirited performance against Billy than what he just showed us against Gabriel Rosado. I think so. I think that, Daniel, he was asleep at the wheel because at this stage in his career, this stage of it, he doesn't get out of bed for guys like Gabriel Rosado. So it was a half-hearted performance, a half-hearted attempt.
Against Gabe.
Whereas, against Billy, he'd be fighting an unbeaten world champion, the kind of guy you gotta get out of bed for, the kind of guy you gotta take serious, you gotta get ready for, because it's a title fight.
Right.
I think that might be what happens next, and it can't be a coincidence that here and now, Daniel Jacobs' schedule is parallel with Billy's. Both of those guys were in action not that long ago.
Not far off from each other.
So that is how I think the cookie is going to crumble here. And if I'm being honest, as a boxing fan, a Daniel Jacobs fight or a Demetrius Andrade fight, either one of those 2 fights are fine by me. But if I had to choose what I'd want to see next, if I had to choose what opponent option I think makes for a more entertaining night of boxing against Billy, given his style, I'd have to say it's Daniel. It would be Daniel Jacobs. A fight between Billy and Demetrius is a high-level fight, but aesthetically, it might not be all that pleasing to the eye, as both of these guys are finesse-fighting guys. Both of these guys, what they're going to give you against somebody else is a chess match. Against each other, it'd be more of
that.
The same thing. Whereas Daniel, he didn't look too spirited against Gabriel Rosado, and we talked about that. We talked about why that might have been. But against Billy, I think that Daniel will make more of a fight of it, and that's what I want to see. I want to see a fight. Those things in mind, what I'm expecting to hear is that an order has come down from the WBO mandating that Billy Joe Saunders defend his title against Daniel Jacobs. That's who I think Paco and the WBO's Board of Champions, whatever the fuck you want to call it, that's who I think they're going to designate as Billy Joe Saunders' mandatory challenger. Not Zach Parker. I think it's going to be Daniel. And finally, ahead of tonight's big welterweight title fight, Thurman says, "My gut says Spence will win. He better not let Garcia land one of those bricks." Thurman was quoted as saying, "Danny Garcia is the biggest puncher I've faced in the ring in my entire professional career." Thurman said as part of a predictions poll released Thursday by Premier Boxing Champions, "Danny's got great timing and a chip on his shoulder from losing 2 close fights to myself and Sean Porter. So, Errol Spence better not let him land one of those bricks. But styles make fights, and my gut says Spence wins without a home run being hit by Garcia. Spence has all of these skills and technique to come out with the W against Garcia, whom I was able to hurt with a big punch in the first round. Spence has that right hook, which he can land to the temple," Thurman said. "And those pot shots, as well as a long, stiff jab to go with the height and reach advantage that led to his complete shutout of Mikey Garcia. But that Spence had that man-down philosophy, and he's not a fighter who plays with his food. When he gets you hurt, he gets you out of there. But it could come down to who lands the biggest punch first. And a lot of folks want to know how Spence is after the car accident." Keith Thurman has made it crystal clear in the build-up of this fight that he wants the winner. He wants the winner of Spence versus Garcia, whereas Errol Spence Jr. has been quite vocal that he's not going to be giving Keith Thurman any opportunities. He's going to do to Keith Thurman what Keith Thurman did to him. As strange as this might sound, there are a small group of people out there who would actually prefer to see Errol Spence Jr. lock horns with Keith Thurman instead of locking horns with Terence Crawford. That if Errol Spence Jr. should win tonight, they want to see him fight Keith. They don't want to see him fight Crawford. Don't ask me why.
Fuck those Haymanites.
Hamanite slide.
You know who those guys are. You know what they're all about. They want to freeze Terence Crawford out of the welterweight division. They want that to continue. The last thing they want to see is a PBC welterweight falter at the hands of Terence Crawford, because then their bubble will burst and they won't be able to take to social media and talk all of the nonsense that they usually talk about Terence Crawford, Top Rank, so on and so forth. But it doesn't look like Errol Spence Jr. will be obliging those people, at least not based on how he's been acting. You know, he just doesn't seem interested in giving Keith Thurman an opportunity. But does that in and of itself bring us closer to a Terence Crawford fight? And I dare say no. I told you guys in my last video, you guys saw who Fox put in that graphic of their 3 big champions, quote unquote. They had Errol Spence Jr. on there, they had Manny Pacquiao on there, and they had Yordenis Ugas on there as well. We know who they didn't have. They didn't have Terence Crawford, but they did have Ugas. It just so happens that next year, Manny Pacquiao, the reigning WBA welterweight champion, is under threat of being stripped of that WBA title. If it happens that way, if by some chance an order comes down from the WBA and Manny does not comply to said order, he could be stripped of that title. Or he might just vacate it himself because he's done in the sport of boxing and he's going to do that crossover fight with Conor McGregor. Could happen that way. One way or another, Manny Pacquiao's reign as a champion may end in 2021. And if it does, Yordenis Ugas will be elevated to full champion status.
Why are you mad?
Making a fight between him and Errol a unification fight, a unification match that doesn't require Errol to lock horns with Terence Crawford.
Or Keith Thurman.
But I'll tell you that Keith Thurman, he still has time. If he can get Yordenis Ugas in the ring sometime early next year, before Manny Pacquiao either vacates the WBA title or is stripped of it, if he can get Ugas in the ring and win that title, he will be henceforth the WBA's full-fledged welterweight champion again. And that's his best bet of getting Errol Spence Jr. in the ring, because Errol, he says he wants all the belts. Well, that would be one of them. Now,
He doesn't want Crawford's.
but maybe he'll want Keith's. Assuming Keith can win it from Ugas and assuming Errol Spence Jr. can win tonight. If they've got to choose between fighting each other or fighting Crawford, you know what they're going to do.